Midnight in Berkeley Castle, where the very stones seemed to sweat and tremble under the weight of centuries. The damp walls loomed, witnessing the silence as a single torch flickered in a cell deep within the keep. On a crude bed, the body of Edward Plantagenet, once King of England, now a relic of his power, lay shackled and exhausted. He was 43 years old, his beard white, his eyes hollow with loss and humiliation. Iron had chewed away at the flesh and bone of his wrists and ankles. All that remained of his majesty was the memory of a crown now exchanged for filth and darkness. His breath wheezed in the thick air, mingling with the stench of sweat and stone. No servants bowed, no banners fluttered. Edward's face was not a mark of command, but of a slow, long erosion of dignity, a face twisted with pain, eyes wide with the final knowledge of his own destruction. Born purple son of Hammer of the Scots, bred to conquer, now disgraced, forgotten by humanity. In the middle of the night the door creaked open, and two anonymous men came. They brought not the promise of mercy, but a medieval instrument of horror, a horned pipe cold and obscene. Edward was pinned. A red-hot iron was shoved into his anus, searing his internal organs, searing his flesh, burning away the last traces of royal blood. The act was a calculated echo of all the whispered accusations, all the rumors that had dogged his reign of forbidden love. Homosexuality had become the pretext and the stage for destruction. Pillows muffled screams, but the agony could not be concealed. The room was filled with the stench of burning flesh and the muted howls of a king being led to the slaughter. When dawn came, Edward's body was found, his face frozen in horror, his lips parted in a final silent scream. The verdict was natural causes, a lie so cold it chilled stone. The manner of his murder, so shameful and cruel, became legendary, a punishment befitting the rumors that haunted that dynasty, his alleged crimes etched into the annals of history with fire and iron. Could it have really happened that way? The darkness offers no answers, only echoes and questions. To find the truth, one must travel back in time, through blood and secrets, through ruined flesh, to the boy born in Caernarfon Castle in 1284. The fourth son was never the image of his father. From the beginning, the shadow of doom clung to his crown. The walls of Berkeley recall what England would rather forget. Power is fragile, and the distance from throne to grave can be measured in a single scorching night. The chill breath of early 14th century England coils through damp stone corridors and shadowed halls. Edward II, born to conquer yet shaped for ruin, moves through this world already half at odds with its brutal certainties. His father, Edward I, was a monarch forged in war and calculation, his hand hard as iron. But his son scorned the theater of chivalry, finding solace not in tournaments or campaigns, but in swimming murky rivers, rowing through fog, crafting trinkets, and toiling beside peasants in muddy fields. More than one chronicle whispers of the prince's sleeves rolled, sweat beading on his brow, digging ditches, mending thatched roofs, his laughter mingling with the lowborn. Such rejection of royal ideals was an insult that could not be borne. The old king's rage was legendary, a tempest that sometimes found its target in the flesh of his own blood. One night, in a fit of fury over a single request, a title for the prince's beloved companion, Piers Gaveston, Edward I seized handfuls of his son's hair, tearing them free as courtiers looked on silent and aghast. Piers Gaveston, a young Gascon nobleman, smuggled first into the household as a companion, but swiftly becoming something more: confidant, obsession, perhaps lover. Their intimacy was the black sun at the center of the prince's life, a bond that would corrode and ultimately destroy his throne. When the old king's bones cooled in 1307, Edward II rose unready and unrepentant, only 23. His first act was to recall Gaveston from exile, exalting him to Earl of Cornwall, a title never before given to one so far from royal blood. Gasps echoed through the court as Gaveston was draped in jewels, allowed to cradle St. Edward's crown itself. During the coronation, a sacrilege that made noble stomachs churn. Tongues wagged. The chronicles grew feverish with rumor and insinuation. He loved him beyond all measure, wrote one bound in a covenant of indissoluble love. Some argued it was but the florid poetry of knightly brotherhood. Others, in hushed tones, spoke of sin sodomy whispered in the shadows, a bishop's accusation thrown across the years like a curse. Whatever its true nature, the devotion was ruinous. The new king's public adoration of Gaveston was poison at the heart of the realm, and every indulgence was a fresh wound. In 1308, Edward wed Isabella of France, a princess whose blood promised alliance and stability. Yet even at his own wedding feast, Edward's gaze fixed on Gaveston, leaving the queen in a circle of candlelight, abandoned and seething, while the king surrendered his crown not to his bride, but to the dark gravity of forbidden affection. The fall had already begun. The castle walls, once resounding with the pride of Plantagenet steel, now echoed with the low murmur of betrayal, and the scent of rot drifted ever closer. A crown heavy with old blood, a throne cracking beneath the weight of betrayal and humiliation. The jewels Edward once pressed into Isabella's hands on their wedding night, gifts meant to bind and dazzle, found their way into the fingers of Gaveston, the king's beloved. For Isabella, a child bride of 12, it was a wound that would fester for decades, a memory of shame burning deeper than any cut. Her humiliation was a stain the court would never let her forget. The nobility seethed. Led by Thomas Earl of Lancaster, they demanded the exile of Gaveston, that shadow always whispering at Edward's side. The king, weak in will but wild in loyalty, complied only to summon Gaveston back with trembling eagerness again and again. Each return was an act of defiance, each exile a farce. The pattern held until 1312, when the barons seized Gaveston and dispensed their own verdict on a lonely stretch of road. They stabbed him, hacked off his head, and left his corpse for the crows. Edward's grief was volcanic. He vowed vengeance, but the steel of the realm bent him into submission, forcing a hollow peace with the killers who had unmade his heart. Edward's reign unraveled. At Bannockburn, the Scots shattered his army, grinding the memory of his father's conquests into the mud. In the shadows of defeat, his court rotted treasury empty. Governance abandoned the king's gaze, ever drawn to favorites. After Gaveston's blood dried, Edward poured his devotion into Hugh Despenser the Younger. The Despensers, father and son, coiled themselves around the throne, draining England of its lifeblood. Their cruelty was legendary. Lands seized, rivals destroyed, execution scaffolds raised for any who opposed their rise. Isabella, now a woman grown and banished to the margins, watched and waited. Her heart fermented into a venomous hatred for the Despensers, and at last for Edward himself. In 1325, when dispatched to France under a banner of diplomacy, she made her escape. She would not return while her enemies held sway. In Paris, she found an ally in exile. Roger Mortimer escaped from the Tower, blood sworn to vengeance. Their alliance was more than political, a union of flesh and fury. The reckoning came swift. September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer sailed across the Channel, their army small, their purpose immense. England greeted them not with swords, but with outstretched hands. Nobles and commoners alike deserted Edward. The king and his Despensers fled, hunted through a country that once called him lord. Capture was inevitable. Hugh Despenser the Younger's fate became a legend of terror. He was dragged by horses strung high above the mob, only to be cut down before death's mercy could claim him. Castrated, his severed genitals burned before his eyes, disemboweled alive as his own entrails hissed and blackened on the fire. At last his head was struck from his body and nailed to London Bridge, a warning carved in blood and ash. And Edward King no more was forced to abdicate his crown, torn away, his son crowned in his stead, while the shadow of his ruin crept ever closer. In the end, power was not lost in battle, but bled away in betrayals, humiliations, and the silent horror of watching every loyalty rot to nothing. The king who once presided over courts of glittering splendor is now reduced to a shadow behind the barred windows of Berkeley Castle. In April, they brought Edward here out of the velvet comfort of royal captivity into a world of damp stone, shivering draughts, and watchful malice. The castle itself seems to brood, its ancient walls closing in with every day. Thomas Berkeley stands guard, his presence cold and impassive. John Maltravers and Thomas Gurney prowl the corridors like jailers from a nightmare. The conditions rot slowly. They force Edward to ride bare the saddle, gnawing raw wounds into his flesh. His cell festers. The stench of neglect clings to the air, and the king's skin blisters with humiliation and disease. Every hour drips with psychological torment, sleep-shattered dignity, shredded every sound in the darkness, a threat or a reminder of how far a king can fall. All is engineered to induce a death that can be called natural, sparing Isabella and Mortimer the stain of regicide. Yet Edward, once delicate in manner, but now clinging to life with the obstinacy of the damned, endures. Whispers run wild. Rescuers may come. The king, rumor says, will not die soon enough. A decision takes root in the silence, a secret final solution. September 21st, 1327, the night of reckoning. What transpired in the cell that night? The question festers in history's marrow. Some chronicles written years after the screams have faded insist on an unspeakable cruelty, a horn thrust into the king's anus, a red-hot iron driven deep, burning from within, leaving no wound the world could see, only agony that blazed behind closed doors. Geoffrey Le Baker's chronicle, penned decades later, spares no detail binding the king's death to the gossip of his supposed sins. The method becomes legend propaganda for a new reign, a means to demonize the murderers, a grim reflection of old accusations. Yet even this horror is not certain. Some voices argue for suffocation, a pillow pressed to the royal face, darkness smothering breath and protest alike. Others go further still. Did Edward die that night at all? In 1333, a letter arrives, slipping into the world like a ghost. Manuel Fieschi's hand, claiming that Edward survived, escaped the living tomb, traded places with a corpse, and vanished into Europe's shadows. There are tales of a hermit in Italy, ragged and penitent. In 1338, at the court of the Holy Roman Empire, a man calling himself William the Welshman claims he is the lost king haunting the world, with the possibility that death was not the end, but a door to oblivion. Yet beneath every theory, every legend, the stone walls of Berkeley remain unchanged, silent, oppressive, bearing witness to power's decay. Edward II, whether dead by iron pillow or secrecy, is remembered not for his crown but for the manner of his unmaking. Such is the monarchy's curse that in the end the only certainty is ruin, and the castle remembers every scream, every lie, every whisper of a king consumed by darkness. The shadow of Edward II lingers in England's damp cathedrals and crumbling castles, a riddle twisting through the centuries. Doubt clings to the tale of his murder, gnawing at the bones of history. Most who chronicle the dark corridors of Berkeley scoff at rumors of his escape, yet some whisper that Edward's heart, beaten but unbroken, may have fled beyond those prison walls. Only one truth stands unyielding. In December 1327, Gloucester Cathedral staged a royal funeral, the candles flickering over a body embalmed beyond all recognition. Whoever lay within that cold sarcophagus, no living soul could read the marks left by torture or betrayal. The stone effigy remains mouth frozen, mid-plea eyes gazing skyward, forever searching for absolution. Vengeance followed swiftly in the reign of Edward III. Gurney was hanged. Maltravers cast into exile, names echoing through the chambers of guilt scapegoats for a son's thirst for justice or the machinations of a court already sodden with secrets. Yet the legend of Edward II's end, whether carved in agony or mere invention, took on a life of its own, seeping into England's blood and memory. Marlow, haunted by the scent of burning flesh, and the silence of dungeons etched the tragedy into the flesh of the stage. His Edward II weeps as both martyr and warning, the details of his torment often left to the flames of imagination, but on stage the red-hot iron gleams and the audience recoils. Thus was cruelty bound to the monarch's memory generation after generation. Edward's fall did more than haunt a nation's nightmares. It shattered the old certainty that kings were unassailable, ordained by God and fate. His forced deposition carved a wound in England's body politic, one that would gape open for Richard II, for Henry VI, for every monarch who felt the throne's cold iron shift beneath them. The myth inseparable from the truth whispered that a king could bleed, could be broken, could be unmade by his own people. And yet another shadow crept through the legend, the relentless pairing of Edward's desires with his downfall. His sexuality, twisted by rumor and moral fury, became the ink with which history wrote its warning, binding shame and love to the memory of pain. Thus, Edward II endures not only as a murdered king, but as the first great cautionary ghost of England, doomed to haunt the borders of power, desire, and ruin. In the end, the tomb at Gloucester is silent, its secrets sealed in stone. The lesson is written in shadow and in blood. Power is never absolute, thrones are never safe, and the walls that confine a king may outlast even the memory of his screams. A legacy drowned in rumor, its surface broken by centuries of whispered sin. In the shadowed corridors of European memory, the idea festers that a monarch's forbidden appetites must call down ruin, a belief that clings to kings like rot to bone, staining the histories of Edward II, James III, Henry III, and all who strayed beyond the sanctioned desires of their crowns. No matter how Edward met his end, whether his flesh was seared from within by red-hot iron, whether death came in some more mundane shape, or whether, as some dare to dream, he slipped unseen into a life of spectral obscurity, his fate remains a warning, raw and unforgettable. His story endures as a living wound, a king torn between craving and command, his soul twisted on the rack of private longing and public power, individuality crushed beneath the boot of medieval necessity. 7 centuries later, the stones of Gloucester Cathedral still cradle his tomb. Pilgrims gather, drawn by the magnetic pull of tragedy, to gaze upon the alabaster effigy, a king calm, almost holy, his features serene and untroubled by death. Yet beneath that polished mask, beneath the cold stone and the careful lies of history, the true horror persists. The monument's dignity is a silent accomplice, concealing the agony that legend swears haunted his last hours. The chasm between monument and memory yawns wide. This is the final irony, a king sculpted in marble for eternity, immortalized in tranquility while the world remembers him not for his rule but for the shrieks that once echoed through the night, the humiliation, the utter loss of power. Edward II, a sovereign who once held absolute sway, ended as the lowest of men, powerless, broken, his name etched forever in the ledger of royal contradictions. In the hush of the cathedral, the stone effigy endures cold and unyielding, even as the story of his fall lives on in every shadow.